At the family reunion, my aunt looked right at me and announced to the entire backyard, "No one here respects you, Sarah. You're just taking up space." The whole barbecue went silent for a beat. Then the conversations resumed, like nothing happened. I stood there holding my paper plate of potato salad, watching my cousins avoid eye contact. But what they didn't know was that in 3 hours, the keynote speaker would call me onto that same stage they'd set up for speeches, and everything they thought they knew about me would crumble. Before we dive in, let me know what time you're watching this and where you're from. Drop a comment because I want to know who else out there has ever felt invisible in their own family. I should have known better than to come. The invitation had arrived 6 weeks earlier, tucked between bills and grocery store flyers. Johnson Family Reunion, celebrating our legacy, printed in gold lettering on cream cardstock. My name was handwritten at the bottom in my cousin Michelle's careful script, like an afterthought. Hope you can make it, Sarah. It's been too long. Too long. That phrase had followed me everywhere since I'd gotten back from my second deployment. Too long since I'd held a steady job that my family understood. Too long since I'd dated anyone they'd approve of. Too long since I'd lived up to whatever version of success they'd mapped out for me before I enlisted. The reunion was being held at Riverside Park in Marietta, Georgia, the same place we'd gathered every 5 years since I was 12. My grandmother had started the tradition back in 1987, convinced that keeping the family connected would somehow shield us all from the world's disappointments. She'd passed 3 years ago, but my Aunt Patricia had taken over the planning with military precision that would have impressed my drill sergeants. I pulled into the gravel parking lot just after noon, my beat-up Honda Civic looking shabby next to the lineup of SUVs and pickup trucks. Through the windshield, I could see the familiar chaos of a Johnson gathering. Kids running between picnic tables, adults clustered in their usual groups, and a makeshift stage decorated with red, white, and blue bunting. A banner stretched between two oak trees read, "Honoring Our Heroes," in bold letters. Heroes. The word sat heavy in my chest as I gathered my purse and the store-bought cookies I'd grabbed at the last minute. 3 tours in Afghanistan, a Purple Heart tucked away in a shoebox, and a medical discharge that came with more questions than answers. But none of that would matter here. Here, I was still just Sarah who couldn't stick with anything, who'd run off to play soldier instead of going to college like a sensible person. The first person I spotted was my cousin David, Patricia's oldest son, manning the registration table. He'd gotten heavier since the last reunion, his polo shirt straining across his middle, but his smile was as practiced as ever. "Sarah, look who decided to show up." His voice carried that particular brand of forced enthusiasm, reserved for family obligations. "Hey, David." I signed my name on the attendance sheet, noting the careful columns Michelle had created. Name, current city, profession, plus guess. The spaces next to my name stayed mostly empty. Current city, Atlanta. Profession. I hesitated, then wrote consultant. It wasn't technically a lie. I did occasional freelance work helping small businesses organize their operations. The fact that it barely paid rent was a detail I'd keep to myself. "Mom's been asking about you," David said, not looking up from his clipboard. "She'll be so glad you're here." The way he said it suggested otherwise, but I nodded and headed toward the main gathering area. The park looked exactly the same as it had 5 years ago, down to the wooden pavilion where the older relatives sat in lawn chairs, fanning themselves with paper plates. Spanish moss hung from the live oaks like party streamers, and the smell of barbecue smoke mixed with the earthy scent of the Chattahoochee River running nearby. Patricia stood at the center of everything, directing traffic with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. She wore a red sundress that showed off her gym membership and jewelry that caught the afternoon sunlight. At 58, she'd perfected the art of looking both welcoming and intimidating, a skill that had served her well in her real estate career. "Sarah, darling." She swept over with arms extended, enveloping me in a cloud of expensive perfume. "I was starting to worry you wouldn't make it. Traffic from Atlanta can be such a nightmare on weekends." "It wasn't too bad," I replied, accepting the hug that felt more like a performance for nearby relatives. "The park looks great. You've outdone yourself." Patricia beamed, her hand still gripping my shoulder. "Well, we wanted to make this special. It's not every day we get to honor the veterans in our family." She gestured toward the stage where a small podium had been set up. We have a wonderful guest speaker coming, Colonel Martinez from the Veterans Affairs Office. He's going to talk about service and sacrifice. My stomach tightened. Of course, they'd invited someone to talk about military service without bothering to ask me, the actual veteran in the family, if I'd like to say anything. But that was typical. My service was something they acknowledged with polite thank yous and flag pins on holidays, not something they actually wanted to understand. That sounds nice, I managed, already calculating how long I'd need to stay to be polite before I could slip away. The afternoon unfolded with predictable rhythm. I made small talk with relatives I saw twice a decade, admired photos of grandchildren whose names I couldn't remember, and ate potato salad that tasted exactly like my grandmother's recipe. My Uncle Jim cornered me by the dessert table to ask if I was still doing that military thing, as if 3 combat deployments were some kind of hobby I'd picked up. My cousin Amanda, fresh from her promotion to regional manager at a bank, spent 20 minutes explaining her new mortgage while I nodded and tried to look interested. But it was the conversations I wasn't part of that stung the most, the ones that stopped when I approached, the glances exchanged when they thought I wasn't looking, the careful way everyone avoided asking what I was doing for work or whether I was seeing anyone. I'd become the family project, the one they discussed in concerned whispers and handled with kid gloves. The breaking point came during the pre-dinner speeches. Patricia had called everyone to gather around the stage for what she called a few words from the family. The usual suspects took their turns. David talked about the importance of tradition. Michelle shared memories of our grandmother. Uncle Jim told the same joke about Yankees and sweet tea that he'd been telling for 15 years. Then Patricia stepped back to the microphone, her expression shifting into something more serious. Before we introduce our special guest speaker, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the challenges our family has faced. We've all had to make sacrifices, and some of us have struggled more than others to find our place in the world. I felt the attention of the crowd shifting, subtle glances in my direction. My face flushed hot and I took a step back, but Patricia wasn't finished. It's important to remember that respect isn't something we're entitled to just because we're family. It's something we earn through our choices, our commitment to each other, and our willingness to contribute meaningfully to our community. Her eyes found mine across the crowd. Some people seem to think that just showing up is enough, but real respect comes from proving your worth over time. The words hit like a slap. Around me, I could feel relatives shifting uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. No one challenged her. They just stood there, letting her humiliation wash over me in waves. That's when she said it, her voice carrying clearly across the gathered family. No one here respects you, Sarah. You're just taking up space. The silence that followed felt like a physical weight. I stood there, paper plate trembling in my hands, watching the faces of people who'd known me since I was born. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked away entirely, but not one of them stepped forward to defend me. I set my plate down on the nearest table, my hands steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. I wouldn't cry. I wouldn't scream. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. Instead, I did what I'd learned to do in combat when everything went sideways. I got very, very quiet. What they didn't know was that Patricia's words would be the last ones she got to say with any authority that day. What they couldn't see was the black sedan pulling into the parking lot, or the distinguished man in uniform stepping out with a folder in his hands. What they had no way of knowing was that in less than 3 hours, everything they thought they understood about respect, about service, and about me would be turned completely upside down. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, I had to survive the next few minutes of standing in that circle, surrounded by family who'd just watched me get publicly dressed down without lifting a finger to help. The afternoon sun beat down on the pavilion, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sound of children playing, oblivious to the adult drama unfolding around the grown-up table. The moments after Patricia's public declaration stretched like taffy in the Georgia heat. I could feel every pair of eyes in that pavilion, some sympathetic, others curious, most just uncomfortable with the whole situation. My cousin Rebecca, who I'd been close to as kids, caught my eye and offered a weak smile before quickly looking away. Even she wasn't going to risk Patricia's wrath by showing me support. I found myself thinking about the last time I'd felt this exposed, this isolated. It was during my final months in Afghanistan, after the IED incident that had ended my military career. Lying in that field hospital in Kandahar, listening to the doctors discuss my future in medical terminology I didn't fully understand, I'd felt the same crushing weight of being completely alone while surrounded by people. But here's the thing about military training that civilians don't understand. It doesn't just teach you how to fight, it teaches you how to observe, how to read a room, how to identify allies and threats. And right now, scanning the faces of my relatives, I was conducting a tactical assessment of my own family reunion. Patricia stood near the stage, basking in the uncomfortable silence she'd created. She wore the satisfied expression of someone who just won an argument, completely unaware that she'd revealed more about herself than about me. Her husband, my Uncle Rick, shifted nervously beside her, checking his watch like he had somewhere important to be. He'd never been comfortable with Patricia's need to be the center of attention, but he'd learned long ago that challenging her publicly was more trouble than it was worth. My cousin Marcus, Patricia's youngest, looked genuinely distressed. He was only 22, fresh out of college with a business degree and that optimistic certainty that the world made sense. Marcus had always been kind to me, sending me care packages during my deployments and staying in touch through social media. Right now, he looked like he wanted to disappear into the Spanish moss hanging from the oak trees. The older generation had clustered together near the picnic tables, whispering among themselves with the practiced discretion of people who'd witnessed decades of family drama. My great aunt Dorothy, 86 and sharp as a tack, kept glancing between Patricia and me with the calculating look of someone mentally keeping score. She'd been married to a World War II veteran for 43 years before he passed, and I suspected she understood things about military service that the rest of the family never would. But it was the kids who broke my heart the most. My second cousin's daughter, maybe 8 years old, tugged on her mother's sundress and asked in a voice that carried across the pavilion, "Mama, why is everybody mad at Cousin Sarah?" Her mother quickly shushed her and led her away toward the playground, but the question hung in the air like smoke. I realized I had two choices. I could leave right now, walk back to my Honda Civic and drive away from this family and their casual cruelty, or I could stay and face whatever came next. The old Sarah, the one who'd left for basic training 12 years ago, might have chosen the first option. But 3 combat tours change you in ways that go deeper than scars. They teach you that sometimes the only way out is through. I straightened my shoulders and looked directly at Patricia. "Thank you for your honesty," I said, my voice carrying the same calm authority I'd used to brief colonels in dusty forward operating bases. "I appreciate knowing exactly where I stand." Patricia's smile faltered slightly. She'd expected tears, maybe anger, certainly some kind of dramatic reaction she could use to justify her behavior. My composure clearly wasn't part of her script. "I just think it's important for everyone to understand," she started. "Oh, I understand perfectly," I interrupted, still maintaining that level tone that made people lean in to listen. "You've made your position crystal clear." I could see some of my relatives exchanging glances. This wasn't going the way Patricia had planned. She'd intended to put me in my place, to demonstrate her authority as the family matriarch. Instead, I was standing there looking like I'd just received a mission briefing, calm and ready for whatever came next. That's when I noticed the black sedan pulling into the gravel parking lot. It was one of those government-issued vehicles you see around military bases and federal buildings, understated but unmistakably official. A man in dress blues got out of the driver's seat, consulted a piece of paper, and began walking toward our gathering. Nobody else had spotted him yet. They were all too focused on the drama Patricia had created, waiting to see how I'd react to being publicly dressed down. But my military training had taught me to always be aware of my surroundings, to notice details that others missed. And this detail was walking directly toward us with the purposeful stride of someone on official business. Colonel Martinez, I assumed. Patricia's guest speaker, arriving right on schedule. I'd heard enough about military protocol to know that colonels didn't usually show up to family barbecues in full dress uniform unless something significant was happening. But Patricia had been so focused on orchestrating my humiliation that she'd forgotten to keep an eye on the bigger picture. I watched him approach, noting the ribbons on his chest, the confident way he carried himself, the folder tucked under his left arm. Something about his bearing reminded me of my old commanding officer, Major Rodriguez, who'd had this way of seeing straight through whatever drama was happening on the surface to the real issues underneath. Patricia, I said quietly, interrupting her mid sentence explanation to my Uncle Jim about the importance of family accountability. I think your guest speaker has arrived. She turned, following my gaze to where Colonel Martinez was now clearly visible, making his way across the park toward our pavilion. Her expression shifted from irritation to confusion to something approaching panic. She began smoothing her hair and adjusting her sundress, suddenly aware that she was about to meet a distinguished military officer immediately after publicly humiliating the one veteran in her family. "Oh my goodness, he's early," she muttered, checking her watch. "I thought he wasn't supposed to arrive until after dinner." I could have told her that military officers tend to be punctual, that showing up early to assess the situation before an official event is standard operating procedure. I could have mentioned that colonels don't usually dress in full ceremonial uniform for casual speaking engagements, that the folder under his arm suggested this was more than just a friendly chat about veterans' benefits. Instead, I stepped back and let Patricia handle her guest speaker however she saw fit. After all, she'd just finished explaining to everyone that I wasn't worth their respect, that I was just taking up space. Surely someone of her obvious leadership capabilities could manage one military officer without input from someone like me. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, the family disappointment, the one who couldn't stick with anything, watching my aunt scramble to present herself properly to represent our family's commitment to honoring veterans, the same family that had just stood by while she publicly humiliated their only combat veteran. Colonel Martinez continued his steady approach, and I found myself studying his face, trying to read his expression. There was something purposeful about his demeanor, something that suggested this wasn't just a routine community outreach visit. Military officers develop a certain look when they're carrying important information, when they know something that's about to change the dynamic of whatever situation they're walking into. I'd seen that look before, usually right before mission briefings that turned out to be more significant than anyone expected. It was the expression of someone who held cards that nobody else knew were in play. Patricia was now frantically trying to restore order to the gathering, gesturing for people to return to their seats, smoothing the tablecloth on the registration table, generally behaving like someone who'd suddenly remembered that first impressions matter. The family drama that had seemed so important 5 minutes ago was rapidly being overshadowed by the arrival of someone who represented a world where actions had consequences and respect, was earned through service, not inherited through bloodlines. What none of them understood yet was that Colonel Martinez wasn't just any guest speaker. He wasn't just there to give a generic talk about supporting veterans. He was there for something much more specific, much more personal. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. First, we all had to get through the introductions, the awkward explanations of what had just transpired, and Patricia's attempt to salvage her reputation in front of a military officer who'd just witnessed her treating a veteran like an unwanted charity case. The afternoon was about to get very interesting. I stood there watching Patricia flutter around like a nervous bird, trying to compose herself before Colonel Martinez reached our little circle of family dysfunction. The transformation was almost comical. 1 minute, she'd been the commanding matriarch putting me in my place. The next, she was smoothing invisible wrinkles from her sundress and checking her lipstick in her phone's camera. The truth was, I'd always been the family ghost. Even before I enlisted, I'd been the one who didn't quite fit the Johnson family mold. While my cousins were collecting academic achievements and climbing corporate ladders, I was working double shifts at the diner to help my mom pay rent. When they were planning sorority formals and spring break trips, I was figuring out how to stretch a box of mac and cheese into 3 meals. Military service hadn't been some patriotic calling for me. It had been survival. The recruiter at the strip mall between the check cashing place and the pawn shop had offered me something nobody else ever had, a chance to earn my way to something better. 3 square meals, a steady paycheck, job training, and the GI Bill waiting at the end if I could make it through. For an 18-year-old whose biggest decision had been whether to work a third job to afford community college, the Army seemed like winning the lottery. But the family had never understood that choice. To them, military service was something you did when you couldn't handle the real world, when you needed structure because you lacked self discipline. They'd sent care packages with the dutiful enthusiasm of people fulfilling an obligation, always including little notes about how proud they were while somehow making it clear that they were counting down the days until I'd come to my senses and find a real career. The first deployment to Afghanistan had been a shock to everyone, including me. I'd joined thinking I'd push papers in some office, maybe work in communications or logistics. Instead, I found myself on convoy duty, riding in vehicles that might explode at any moment, learning to read every piece of trash on the roadside as a potential threat. The family's weekly emails during that tour had been exercises in careful avoidance. Lots of news about who was getting married or promoted, very few questions about what I was actually doing over there. When I came home after that first deployment, I could see the disconnect in their eyes. They wanted to honor my service in abstract terms, to post supportive messages on social media and thank me for my sacrifice. But they didn't want to hear about the nightmares, the hypervigilance, or the way I'd jump every time a car backfired. That kind of honesty made family barbecues uncomfortable. The second deployment had been harder. By then, I'd been promoted to sergeant and was leading my own team. The responsibility of keeping people alive while navigating the complex politics of a war zone had aged me in ways that showed in my eyes, but not on any official record. I'd learned to make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between everyone going home or someone's family getting a folded flag. During that tour, the family emails had become more sporadic. Life back home had continued without me. Weddings I couldn't attend, births I missed, graduations that happened while I was literally on the other side of the world. When I finally returned, I felt like I was looking at my relatives through bulletproof glass. We could see each other, but nothing I said seemed to translate properly. The third deployment had been my last, though I hadn't known about it at the time. By then, I'd been promoted again and was working closely with Afghan military units, trying to train local forces while staying alive in an increasingly dangerous environment. The IED that ended my military career had been hidden under a pile of construction debris on a road we'd traveled dozens of times before. One moment, I was discussing patrol routes with my team. The next, I was waking up in a German hospital with doctors explaining why my left leg would never work quite the same way again. The medical discharge had come with a Purple Heart, a medical pension that barely covered basic expenses, and a set of skills that didn't translate well to civilian job interviews. I'd tried explaining my military experience to potential employers, but managed logistics for a forward operating base somehow never sounded as impressive as regional sales manager or senior account executive. That's how I'd ended up doing freelance consulting work, helping small businesses organize their operations and streamline their processes. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't the kind of career that impressed relatives at family gatherings. But it was honest work that drew on everything I'd learned about logistics, leadership, and crisis management during my military service. The family had never quite known what to do with my return to civilian life. They'd expected me to bounce back quickly, to translate my military experience into immediate success in the corporate world. When that didn't happen, when I spent months learning to walk without limping and fighting through PTSD symptoms that made job interviews feel like combat missions, they'd gradually shifted from supportive to concerned to subtly disappointed. Patricia, as the self appointed family spokesperson, had been the worst about it. She'd never served a day in uniform, never missed a meal, or slept in a tent, or wondered if today would be the day an IED took her out. But she had very strong opinions about what veterans should be able to accomplish once they returned to normal life. Her husband Rick had served briefly in the Navy during peacetime, working in an administrative role on a base in Virginia, and she treated that limited experience as qualification to speak for all military families. The irony was that I'd never asked for special treatment. I'd never expected the family to understand what combat was like or to accommodate my adjustment challenges. All I'd wanted was basic respect, the kind of acknowledgement that my service had been real and meaningful, that the sacrifices I'd made had been worthwhile. Instead, I'd gotten polite tolerance mixed with subtle disappointment, conversations that stopped when I entered the room, careful invitations that made it clear my presence was more obligation than desire. And today, finally, Patricia's honest assessment of what the family really thought of me. Standing there in the Georgia heat, watching her prepare to greet Colonel Martinez, I felt something shifting inside me. It wasn't anger exactly, though there was some of that. It wasn't hurt, though that was there too. It was more like resignation mixed with curiosity. I was finally seeing the situation clearly, without the filters of hope or family loyalty that had obscured the truth for so long. Patricia wasn't just having a bad day or speaking out of turn. This was who she really was, who they all really were when they thought I couldn't fight back. They'd spent years treating me like a charity case, someone to be managed and contained rather than respected and included. But what they'd forgotten, what they'd never really understood, was that military service doesn't just change how you handle physical threats. It changes how you handle everything. It teaches you patience, strategic thinking, and the ability to wait for the right moment to act. It shows you that sometimes the best response to an attack isn't immediate retaliation. It's careful observation, followed by decisive action when the timing is perfect. Colonel Martinez was now close enough that I could see the details of his dress uniform, the precise arrangement of his ribbons, the confident set of his shoulders that marked him as someone accustomed to command. He wasn't just a guest speaker showing up to give a generic presentation. There was something purposeful about his presence, something that suggested this visit was more significant than Patricia understood. I stepped back slightly, positioning myself where I could observe both the approaching colonel and my family's reaction to his presence. After years of being the outsider looking in, I was about to become the insider watching everyone else scramble to understand what was really happening. The afternoon was about to take a turn that none of them saw coming. Colonel Martinez approached our pavilion with the measured stride of someone who'd spent decades commanding respect without demanding it. He was maybe 55, with salt and pepper hair cut in military precision, and the kind of bearing that made even civilians stand a little straighter. His dress blues were immaculate, every ribbon and insignia placed exactly where regulation demanded, and he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who'd earned his rank through decades of service rather than politics. Patricia intercepted him halfway across the grass, her nervous energy practically vibrating as she extended her hand. Colonel Martinez, welcome to our family reunion. I'm Patricia Johnson. We spoke on the phone about your presentation today. The colonel accepted her handshake with professional courtesy, but I noticed his eyes scanning the gathering behind her, taking in the scattered family groups, the makeshift stage, and the general atmosphere of barely contained dysfunction that seemed to follow Johnson family events like a persistent cloud. Mrs. Johnson, he replied, his voice carrying the crisp pronunciation of someone accustomed to being understood for the first time. Thank you for inviting me to speak to your family about veteran affairs. Though I should mention my schedule has been adjusted somewhat. I have some additional business to attend to while I'm here. Patricia's smile faltered slightly. She'd clearly been planning to control the colonel's visit the same way she managed everything else in the family, with careful orchestration and her own agenda firmly in place. The suggestion that he had business beyond her carefully planned presentation seemed to catch her off guard. Additional business? She asked, her voice taking on that slightly higher pitch it always got when things weren't going according to her script. Yes, ma'am. Official business that takes precedence over speaking engagements. He glanced around the gathering again, and I had the distinct impression he was looking for someone specific. But I understand you've organized quite an event here. Perhaps we could begin with the presentation and then I can handle the other matter afterward. The rest of the family had begun to notice the colonel's arrival, and people were gravitating toward our little cluster with the inevitable curiosity that draws relatives to potential drama. My cousin David abandoned his registration table and hurried over, probably hoping to insert himself into whatever conversation might boost his standing in the family hierarchy. Michelle appeared at Patricia's elbow, clearly ready to assist with whatever coordination might be needed. But it was my great aunt Dorothy who caught my attention. She'd made her way over from the senior citizens seating area, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose age had taught her to conserve energy for what mattered. At 86, Dorothy had outlived two husbands and most of her siblings, and she'd developed the kind of sharp perception that comes from decades of watching family dynamics play out. She positioned herself near the edge of our group, close enough to hear everything but far enough away to avoid being drawn into Patricia's organizational frenzy. When she caught my eye, she gave me the slightest nod. Not agreement, exactly, but acknowledgement. Dorothy had been married to my great uncle Frank, who'd served in World War II in Korea, and she'd spent 43 years living with someone who understood the weight of military service in ways that most of our family never would. Colonel, Patricia was saying, her voice now carrying the forced brightness she used when she was trying to regain control of a situation. Let me introduce you to some of our family members. This is my son, David. He's in insurance sales, very successful. And this is my daughter in law, Michelle. She's a teacher. David stepped forward with the aggressive handshake of someone trying to make an impression, immediately launching into a description of his recent promotion and his company's commitment to supporting veterans through their insurance programs. Michelle smiled politely and mentioned her classroom's Veterans Day activities, clearly trying to demonstrate her respect for military service. I watched this performance with the detached fascination of someone observing a ritual in a foreign culture. This was how my family always handled encounters with authority figures: immediate attempts to establish their credentials, to prove their worthiness for attention and respect. It was the same dance I'd watched at every family gathering, whether the outsider was a pastor, a boss, or now a military officer. Colonel Martinez listened politely to their introductions, responding with the professional courtesy that officers learn to deploy in civilian settings. But I could see him continuing to scan the crowd, and I was beginning to suspect that his additional business wasn't as separate from this family gathering as Patricia assumed. The extended family continued to converge on our little circle, drawn by the unmistakable magnetism of someone in dress blues. Military uniforms have a way of commanding attention, even in civilian settings, representing authority and sacrifice in ways that most people recognize, even if they don't fully understand. My cousin Marcus pushed through the crowd, his young face bright with genuine enthusiasm, as he introduced himself to the colonel. "Sir, I just wanted to thank you for your service," Marcus said, his voice carrying the earnest respect of someone who'd grown up post 9/11 and understood that military service meant real sacrifice. My cousin Sarah served 3 tours in Afghanistan, and I've always admired what our military does for the country. I felt a flicker of warmth at Marcus's words, the first time anyone had mentioned my service in the context of the colonel's visit. But Patricia quickly inserted herself back into the conversation, clearly uncomfortable with attention being directed anywhere other than her carefully orchestrated presentation. "Yes, well, we're all very proud of our veterans," she said, her tone suggesting that the topic of my service was something to be acknowledged briefly and then moved past. "Colonel, I thought you might want to see the stage we've set up for your presentation. We've arranged seating for about 60 people, and we have a sound system if you need it." As Patricia led the colonel toward the makeshift stage, chattering about logistics and timing, I found myself falling into step slightly behind them. Not because I was eager to be part of the conversation, but because something about the colonel's presence had triggered my tactical awareness. There was something purposeful about his visit, something beyond the routine community outreach that Patricia had described. The stage itself was typical of Patricia's organizational style, overdone but functional. Red, white, and blue bunting draped the platform, folding chairs arranged in neat rows facing a podium decorated with a small American flag. It looked like a campaign rally or a high school graduation, the kind of generic patriotic setup that gets assembled for any event requiring a show of national pride. "This is lovely," Colonel Martinez said, though his tone suggested polite assessment rather than genuine enthusiasm. "Very patriotic. I'm sure your family takes pride in honoring veterans." There was something in the way he said that last sentence that made me pay closer attention. It wasn't quite sarcasm, but it carried an undertone that suggested he might have his own opinions about how families should honor veterans. Given what had transpired just minutes before his arrival, I wondered if he'd somehow witnessed Patricia's public assessment of my worth to the family. "Oh, absolutely," Patricia replied, oblivious to any subtext. We believe very strongly in supporting our troops. That's why we wanted to have you here today, to help our younger family members understand the importance of military service. She gestured toward the crowd of relatives, most of whom were now gathered around the stage area, waiting to see what would happen next. Children sat cross-legged on the grass, while adults claimed the folding chairs, everyone settling in for what they expected to be a standard presentation about veterans' benefits and patriotic duty. But I noticed that Colonel Martinez wasn't looking at the stage or the assembled audience. His attention kept returning to the folder tucked under his arm, and twice I saw him glance at his watch as if he was operating on a timeline that Patricia knew nothing about. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, his voice taking on a slightly more formal tone. "Before we begin the presentation, I should mention that I'll need to speak with one of your family members privately. Official business, as I mentioned earlier." Patricia's smile became slightly fixed, the expression of someone who was beginning to suspect that her carefully planned event was about to veer off script. "Of course, Colonel. Is there anything I can help you with? I know everyone in the family, and I'd be happy to coordinate whatever you need." "Thank you, but this is something I need to handle directly." He paused, and I saw his eyes sweep the crowd once more before settling on me. "I'm looking for Sergeant Sarah Johnson. I understand she's part of your family." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the river running beyond the trees. Every head in the gathering turned toward me, but the expressions on their faces ranged from confusion to something that looked almost like fear. Patricia's mouth opened and closed without producing any sound, and I could see her trying to process this unexpected development. After years of being the family afterthought, suddenly I was the center of attention for reasons that nobody understood, including me. The moment Colonel Martinez spoke my name, the entire gathering went silent in a way that felt different from Patricia's earlier dramatic pause. This wasn't the uncomfortable quiet of family embarrassment. This was the electric stillness that happens when everyone suddenly realizes they're witnessing something significant, something that might change everything they thought they knew. I felt every pair of eyes in that pavilion turn toward me, but the quality of their attention had shifted completely. 10 minutes ago, I'd been the family disappointment, the one taking up space at their reunion. Now I was someone a full colonel in dress blues had driven to Marietta specifically to find. The cognitive dissonance was written across their faces in expressions of confusion, curiosity, and something that looked suspiciously like concern. "That would be me, sir," I said, stepping forward with the automatic response that years of military training had embedded in my nervous system. My voice carried clearly across the pavilion, steady and professional despite the chaos spinning in my head. Whatever this was about, I was going to handle it with the dignity that my service had earned, regardless of how my family had just finished treating me. Colonel Martinez's eyes met mine, and I saw something there that made my chest tighten. It wasn't the polite acknowledgement of a routine visit, or the sympathetic expression of someone delivering bad news. It was the look of someone who knew things about me that I didn't know myself, someone carrying information that was about to change my understanding of my own story. "Sergeant Johnson," he said, his voice carrying the formal tone that officers use when they're about to shift into official business. "I need to speak with you privately, if you don't mind. This concerns your military service record." The folder under his arm suddenly seemed to weigh more, to carry significance that I couldn't identify but that made my palms damp with nervous sweat. Military service record could mean a lot of things, from routine updates to medal corrections to problems that had surfaced months or years after discharge. Given my family's recent assessment of my worth, I found myself bracing for whatever new disappointment might be coming. Patricia, who had been rendered speechless by this unexpected turn of events, finally found her voice. "Colonel, I'm sure we can arrange some privacy for you. Perhaps you could use the park office, or we could clear out the pavilion." "Ma'am?" Colonel Martinez interrupted gently but firmly. "This is official military business. I'll need to speak with Sergeant Johnson alone, without family members present." The emphasis on alone was unmistakable, and I saw Patricia's face flush with the frustration of someone who was used to being included in every important conversation that happened within her sphere of influence. She'd spent the entire afternoon positioning herself as the family authority figure, the one who made decisions and controlled access to information. Now she was being explicitly excluded from something that concerned her own family member. Of course, she managed, though her voice carried an edge of barely contained irritation. Sarah, perhaps you could. Sergeant Johnson, Colonel Martinez said, addressing me directly and effectively cutting Patricia out of the conversation entirely. Is there somewhere we could speak privately? This shouldn't take long, but it's important. I looked around the park, my mind automatically shifting into the tactical assessment mode that had kept me alive during 3 combat deployments. The pavilion was too public, surrounded by curious relatives who would strain to overhear every word. The park office was locked, and I didn't want to ask Patricia for keys that would give her an excuse to hover nearby. But there was a small maintenance building near the river, far enough from the main gathering to ensure privacy, but still within sight of the reunion. There's a building down by the water, I said, pointing toward the river. It should be quiet enough for whatever you need to discuss. Colonel Martinez nodded approval. Lead the way, Sergeant. As we walked away from the pavilion, I could feel the weight of my family's attention following us. Conversations had stopped entirely, and I knew that everyone was watching our retreating figures with the kind of intense curiosity that only family members can generate when they smell potential drama. I'd spent years being the invisible one, the afterthought who could slip away from gatherings without anyone noticing. Now I was the center of attention in a way that felt both terrifying and oddly satisfying. The walk to the maintenance building took maybe 3 minutes, but it felt like an hour. Colonel Martinez matched my pace, and I noticed that his stride accommodated the slight limp that I'd never quite managed to eliminate after the IED incident. It was a small gesture, but it suggested an awareness of my physical limitations that felt different from the careful politeness that most people offered when they noticed my injury. The maintenance building was a simple concrete structure used to store park equipment and supplies. It had a small covered area with a concrete bench that provided shade and enough privacy for a conversation that apparently required official discretion. I sat down on the bench, my hands folded in my lap in a posture that felt automatically respectful, while Colonel Martinez remained standing, his dress blues still pristine despite the Georgia heat. Sergeant Johnson, he began, opening the folder he'd been carrying, I want to start by saying that what I'm about to share with you is information that should have been communicated months ago. There was a processing delay in the Pentagon that prevented this recognition from being handled in a timely manner. Recognition. The word hit me like a physical blow, and I felt my carefully maintained composure waver slightly. In military terms, recognition could mean a lot of things. But when a full colonel drove to a family reunion in dress blues to deliver it personally, it usually meant something significant. Sir, I managed, my voice sounding smaller than I intended. Colonel Martinez pulled out a document that looked official, with the kind of heavy paper and formal seals that the military used for important communications. During your 3rd deployment to Afghanistan, you participated in an operation that provided critical intelligence that led to the disruption of a major IED network. The intelligence you gathered during that mission saved an estimated 37 American lives and prevented dozens of civilian casualties. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. The mission he was referencing had been routine reconnaissance, or at least it had seemed routine at the time. My team had been tasked with gathering information about insurgent activity in a sector that had been seeing increased IED attacks. We'd spent weeks building relationships with local informants, mapping supply routes, and documenting patterns that might help identify the source of the bomb-making materials. The operation was classified at the time, Colonel Martinez continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone delivering information that had been carefully guarded for months. But the classification has been reduced, and the Pentagon has completed its assessment of the intelligence value of your team's work. Your leadership during that mission and the risks you took to gather critical information have been recognized at the highest levels of command. He pulled out another document, this one with a blue ribbon attached. Sergeant Johnson, by order of the Secretary of Defense, you are hereby awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States. The Silver Star. I'd heard of it, of course. Every soldier knew the hierarchy of military decorations. but I'd never imagined that anything I'd done during my deployments would be considered worthy of such recognition. The Silver Star was the third highest military decoration for valor, awarded for gallantry in action that didn't quite meet the criteria for the Medal of Honor or Distinguished Service Cross. I don't understand, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The mission was routine. We were just gathering intelligence. Sergeant, you led a team into hostile territory for 6 consecutive nights, gathering information that required direct contact with enemy forces. You personally identified and mapped the IED network that was responsible for killing American soldiers. That intelligence led to operations that dismantled the entire network and captured its leadership. The words were starting to penetrate the shock that had settled over my mind like fog. I remembered those nights, the careful movement through territory that we knew was watched by hostile forces, the painstaking work of documenting everything we observed. But it had felt like routine work, the kind of job that soldiers did because it needed to be done, not because it was heroic. The IED that ended your military career, Colonel Martinez continued, was likely placed by members of that same network, possibly in retaliation for the intelligence you gathered. Your sacrifice wasn't just the injury that ended your service, it was the months of dangerous work that led to saving dozens of lives. I felt tears building behind my eyes, but I blinked them back. After years of feeling like my military service had been meaningless, like I'd wasted 3 deployments on activities that didn't matter, I was learning that my work had been significant enough to warrant recognition at the highest levels of the military hierarchy. Sir, I said, my voice steady despite the emotional storm building in my chest. I'm honored. But I don't understand why this is being presented here at my family reunion. Colonel Martinez smiled, the first genuine expression I'd seen from him since his arrival. Sergeant, the Silver Star is traditionally presented in a ceremony with family and friends present. When we discovered that you were attending a family gathering today, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to ensure that the people who matter to you could witness this recognition. Family and friends, people who matter to you. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't been so painful. 20 minutes ago, these same family members had stood by while Patricia publicly declared that none of them respected me, that I was just taking up space at their reunion. Now I was sitting here learning that my military service had been significant enough to earn one of the highest decorations the United States military could bestow, and that a full colonel had driven to Marietta specifically to present it to me in front of the family who had just finished explaining why I didn't deserve their respect. The afternoon was about to get very interesting indeed. I sat on that concrete bench staring at the Silver Star in Colonel Martinez's hands, the blue ribbon catching the filtered sunlight that came through the trees. The medal itself was beautiful in its simplicity, a bronze star suspended from the distinctive blue ribbon with thin red and white stripes. But more than its physical appearance, it represented something I'd never expected to receive: official recognition that my service had mattered, that the nights I'd spent crawling through hostile territory and the risks I'd taken had saved lives. Sergeant, Colonel Martinez said, settling onto the bench beside me, I know this is a lot to process. The Pentagon should have handled this recognition months ago, and I apologize for the delay. But I want you to understand something important. This isn't a consolation prize or a gesture of sympathy for your medical discharge. This is recognition for extraordinary service that met the highest standards of military valor. I nodded, still trying to reconcile this moment with everything that had happened over the past hour. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Going from family embarrassment to Silver Star recipient in the span of 20 minutes felt like emotional whiplash. But underneath the shock, I could feel something else building, a quiet pride that I'd almost forgotten I was capable of feeling. The citation, Colonel Martinez continued, opening the folder to another official document, details the specific actions that led to this recognition. Would you like me to read it to you? Yes, sir, I replied, my voice steadier now as I settled into the familiar rhythm of military protocol. Colonel Martinez cleared his throat and began reading in the formal tone reserved for official citations. The Silver Star is presented to Sergeant Sarah Marie Johnson, United States Army, for gallantry in action while engaged in military operations involving conflict with an armed hostile force in Afghanistan. During the period of March 15th through April 2nd, 2022, Sergeant Johnson demonstrated exceptional courage and leadership while conducting reconnaissance operations in the Helmand province. As he read, memories began flooding back with startling clarity. Those 18 days in March and April had been some of the most intense of my military career, though at the time they'd felt like routine operations. My team had been tasked with gathering intelligence about a sophisticated IED network that had killed 6 American soldiers and wounded dozens more over the previous months. Sergeant Johnson voluntarily led her team on 6 high-risk night missions into territory known to be under enemy observation. Despite the consistent threat of hostile contact, she established and maintained relationships with local informants who provided critical intelligence about enemy operations, supply routes, and leadership structure. I remembered those informants, farmers and shopkeepers who risked their lives to provide information that might help stop the bombings that were terrorizing their communities as much as they were targeting American forces. Building trust with them had required hours of careful conversation, often in locations where discovery by insurgent forces would have meant death for all of us. On the night of March 28th, Sergeant Johnson's team made direct contact with enemy forces while conducting reconnaissance of a suspected bomb-making facility. Under hostile fire, Sergeant Johnson successfully extracted her team while securing intelligence materials that led to the identification and subsequent capture of the IED network's leadership. That night came back to me in vivid detail: the sudden crack of gunfire, the adrenaline surge of combat, the split-second decisions that determined whether everyone made it home alive. I'd managed to grab documents and electronic devices from the facility before we withdrew under fire, but at the time, it had felt like a routine collection of potential intelligence, not heroic action. The intelligence gathered during these operations led directly to coordinated strikes that eliminated the IED network responsible for 23 American casualties and an estimated 40 civilian deaths. Sergeant Johnson's courage, leadership, and dedication to mission accomplishment reflect the highest credit upon herself, her unit, and the United States Army. Colonel Martinez finished reading and looked up at me. Sergeant, the intelligence you gathered during those operations was used in what became known as Operation Clean Sweep, the most successful counter-IED operation conducted in that sector of Afghanistan. The network you helped identify and dismantle had been responsible for some of the most sophisticated bomb attacks our forces encountered during the entire deployment. I felt a strange mixture of pride and sorrow washing over me. Pride because my work had apparently been more significant than I'd ever understood, but sorrow because none of this recognition could bring back the soldiers who'd been killed before we'd managed to stop the network. Military service teaches you that success is often measured not in lives saved, but in lives not lost, and that distinction carries a weight that civilians rarely understand. Sir, I said quietly, my team deserves recognition too. I couldn't have accomplished any of this alone. Sergeant Thompson and Corporal Williams have both received Bronze Stars for their service during those operations. Colonel Martinez replied, and Specialist Martinez, no relation despite the name, received a Commendation Medal. Everyone who contributed to the mission's success has been recognized appropriately. Learning that my team had also been honored brought another wave of emotion. These were people I'd served with, people whose lives I'd been responsible for during those dangerous weeks. Knowing that their contributions had been recognized felt almost as important as my own medal. Colonel Martinez stood up, returning to the formal posture that marked the transition from personal conversation to official ceremony. Sergeant Johnson, if you're ready, I'd like to present this medal to you in front of your family. It's traditional for the Silver Star to be presented with loved ones present, and I understand today's gathering provides that opportunity. The word loved ones hung in the air between us, carrying implications that we both understood. My family had just finished making their feelings about me crystal clear, but military protocol called for recognition to be witnessed by those closest to the recipient. The irony was so sharp it was almost funny. Almost. Colonel, I said, standing to face him, I'm honored to receive this recognition, and I understand the protocol. But I think you should know that my family's relationship with my military service is complicated. Colonel Martinez studied my face with the perceptive look of someone who'd spent decades reading people in high stress situations. Sergeant, I've been presenting military awards for over 20 years. I've seen families who were proud, families who were confused, and families who were indifferent. But I've never seen a family that wasn't changed by witnessing the recognition of genuine heroism. His words carried a weight that suggested he understood more about family dynamics than his formal military bearing might suggest. There was something in his expression that indicated he'd witnessed the transformative power of moments like this, where official recognition forced people to reconsider their assumptions about someone they thought they knew. The choice is yours, Sergeant, he continued. We can conduct a private ceremony here, or we can return to your family gathering and present the medal there. But I will say this. Military awards aren't just recognition for the recipient. They're also education for everyone who witnesses the presentation. Sometimes people need to be shown what real service and sacrifice look like. I thought about Patricia's words, still echoing in my memory. No one here respects you. You're just taking up space. I thought about the years of polite tolerance, the subtle dismissals, the careful way my family had managed my presence at their gatherings. I thought about the assumptions they'd made about my military service, the way they'd treated it as a phase I'd gone through rather than a defining experience that had shaped who I'd become. And then I thought about the soldiers whose lives had been saved by the intelligence I'd gathered, about the families who still had their loved ones because my team had been willing to crawl through hostile territory night after night. I thought about the weight of the Silver Star and what it represented. Not just personal recognition, but acknowledgement of service that had real meaning and real impact. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. Colonel, I said, my voice carrying the same steady authority I'd used when briefing operations in Afghanistan. I think my family needs to understand what military service actually means. Let's go back to the reunion. Walking back across the park toward the pavilion felt like approaching a mission objective, each step measured and deliberate. Colonel Martinez matched my pace, the Silver Star citation folder tucked securely under his arm, his dress blues catching the late afternoon sunlight. I could see my family scattered around the gathering area, some seated at picnic tables, others standing in small clusters, all of them clearly waiting to see what would emerge from our private conversation. Patricia stood near the makeshift stage, her posture rigid with barely contained frustration. She'd spent the entire afternoon orchestrating events according to her vision, and my sudden elevation to the center of military attention had disrupted her carefully planned narrative. I could see her scanning our approach, trying to read our expressions for clues about what had transpired during our private meeting. Marcus was the first to notice our return, standing up from his seat at one of the picnic tables and nudging his girlfriend, Emma. The ripple effect spread through the gathering as people became aware that the mysterious official business was apparently concluding. Conversations died down, and I could feel that peculiar family attention that combines genuine curiosity with the subtle competitiveness that marks most Johnson gatherings. My great aunt Dorothy had claimed a lawn chair near the stage, positioning herself with the strategic awareness of someone who'd learned to secure the best vantage point for whatever drama might unfold. She caught my eye as we approached and gave me another of those slight nods that conveyed more than words. Acknowledgement, perhaps even approval, of whatever was about to happen. Colonel Martinez paused about 20 feet from the main gathering, his bearing shifting into the formal mode that preceded official military ceremonies. Ladies and gentlemen, he called out, his voice carrying the natural authority that made everyone stop talking and turn their attention toward us. If I could have your attention, please. I have some official business to conduct. The family converged on the stage area with the inevitable gravitational pull of people, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Patricia immediately tried to insert herself into the proceedings, stepping forward with her hostess smile firmly in place. Of course, Colonel, she said, her voice carrying that bright tone she used when trying to regain control of situations that had moved beyond her management. We're all very interested to hear what you have to share with us about Veterans Affairs. Ma'am? Colonel Martinez replied with polite firmness. This isn't about Veterans Affairs in general. This is about recognizing specific acts of valor performed by a member of your family. The word valor seemed to hit the gathering like a small explosion. I could see confusion spreading across faces as relatives tried to process what they were hearing. Valor was a word associated with heroes, with the kinds of military service that got written about in newspapers and commemorated with monuments. It wasn't a word they'd ever associated with me. David stepped forward, his insurance salesman instincts apparently telling him that this was a moment that called for family spokesperson behavior. Colonel, we're all very proud of Sarah's service, of course. We've always supported our veterans. The casual dismissiveness in his tone made me wince, but Colonel Martinez's expression didn't change. He'd clearly dealt with civilian misunderstandings of military service before, and he had the patience of someone accustomed to educating people about realities they'd never experienced. I'm sure you are, Colonel Martinez replied diplomatically, which is why I thought it would be appropriate to present this recognition in front of Sergeant Johnson's family. He gestured for me to join him near the makeshift podium, and I stepped forward, my heart pounding with a mixture of pride and anxiety. This wasn't how I'd imagined my family learning about my military service, through an official ceremony conducted by a colonel in dress blues, but there was something fitting about the moment. After years of having my service treated as a minor detail in family conversations, it was finally taking center stage. Sergeant Sarah Johnson, Colonel Martinez began, his voice carrying across the pavilion with the clarity of someone accustomed to addressing large groups, served 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan with distinction. During her final deployment, she led reconnaissance operations that resulted in intelligence gathering of critical importance to American military operations. I could see my relatives exchanging glances, their expressions shifting from casual interest to something approaching concern. This wasn't the generic "thank you for your service" presentation they'd been expecting. This was specific, official, and clearly building towards something none of them had anticipated. Colonel Martinez opened his folder and removed the citation document. The intelligence gathered by Sergeant Johnson and her team led directly to the disruption of an IED network responsible for multiple American casualties. Her leadership under fire, her courage in hostile territory, and her dedication to mission accomplishment saved an estimated 37 American lives. 37 lives. The number hung in the air like a challenge, demanding to be processed by people who'd spent years treating my military service as something vaguely admirable but ultimately irrelevant to real life. I could see the calculation happening behind their eyes. 37 people who were alive because of work I'd done in places they couldn't imagine, facing dangers they'd never contemplated.
Patricia's mouth had fallen open slightly, her carefully maintained composure cracking as she tried to reconcile this information with her assessment of me as someone who couldn't stick with anything worthwhile. Beside her, Rick shifted uncomfortably, probably remembering his own brief and uneventful Navy service and comparing it to what he was hearing about combat operations. For her exceptional gallantry in action, Colonel Martinez continued, Sergeant Johnson has been awarded the Silver Star, the 3rd highest military decoration for valor that can be bestowed by the United States Armed Forces. The Silver Star itself emerged from the folder, the blue ribbon bright against Colonel Martinez's dress uniform. Several of my younger cousins gasped audibly. Even civilians recognized the significance of military medals, and the Silver Star carried a weight that transcended specific knowledge of military decorations. Sergeant Johnson, Colonel Martinez said, turning toward me with the formal bearing that marked the ceremony's climactic moment. By order of the Secretary of Defense, and in recognition of your gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States, you are hereby awarded the Silver Star. The medal felt heavier than I'd expected when he placed it in my hands, weighted not just with metal, but with the accumulated significance of everything it represented. 3 deployments, countless nights in hostile territory, the lives saved and lost, the injury that ended my military career. All of it condensed into this moment of official recognition. The citation, Colonel Martinez announced to the gathered family, will be read into the permanent record and Sergeant Johnson's actions will be preserved as part of the official history of American military operations in Afghanistan. I looked out at my family's faces and saw something I'd never seen before, genuine shock mixed with what might have been the beginning of respect. These were people who'd known me since childhood, who'd watched me struggle through adolescence and make the decision to enlist. They'd never imagined that the quiet, unremarkable girl who'd left for basic training 12 years ago would return as someone worthy of one of the military's highest honors. Marcus was the first to break the stunned silence, starting to clap with the enthusiastic approval of someone who'd always believed in me even when the rest of the family had written me off. His applause was picked up by Emma, then by some of the younger cousins spreading through the gathering like a wave. But it was my great-aunt Dorothy's reaction that meant the most to me. She stood up from her lawn chair with the deliberate effort that marked her age, but her expression carried the fierce pride of someone who understood exactly what she was witnessing. She'd been married to a combat veteran for 4 decades, and she knew the difference between routine service and the kind of heroism that earned silver stars. "Frank would have been so proud," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the pavilion despite her age. "He always said the real heroes were the ones who saved lives, not the ones who took them." The comparison to my great-uncle Frank, who'd been the family's military hero for my entire life, hit me like a physical blow. Frank had been wounded at Normandy and awarded the Bronze Star, and his military service had been the gold standard against which all other family achievements were measured. To have Dorothy compare my service to his felt like the ultimate validation. Patricia stood frozen near the stage, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. The woman who'd just finished explaining to everyone why I didn't deserve their respect was now faced with official military recognition that contradicted everything she'd said about my worth to the family. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the pavilion. But the real change wasn't in the lighting. It was in the way my family was looking at me, not with the polite tolerance I'd grown accustomed to, but with something approaching awe. The applause that had started with Marcus spread through the gathering, but it wasn't uniform. Some relatives clapped with genuine enthusiasm, their expressions showing the kind of surprise that comes from discovering something remarkable about someone you thought you knew completely. Others offered more hesitant applause, clearly struggling to reconcile this new information with their long-held assumptions about my place in the family hierarchy. Patricia's face had gone through several color changes, settling on a pale shade that suggested she was beginning to understand the full implications of what had just transpired. 20 minutes ago, she'd publicly humiliated me in front of this same audience, declaring that nobody respected me and that I was just taking up space. Now that same audience was witnessing me receive one of the highest military honors the United States could bestow. Colonel Martinez maintained his formal bearing throughout the applause, waiting for it to die down before continuing with the ceremony. When the pavilion grew quiet again, he addressed the family with the kind of measured authority that made even the most skeptical relatives pay attention. "I want the family to understand," he said, his voice carrying across the gathering, "that the Silver Star is not awarded lightly. Less than 1% of military personnel ever receive this level of recognition. It requires documented acts of gallantry in the face of enemy action, verified by multiple witnesses, and reviewed by the highest levels of military command." David, who had been shifting uncomfortably since the presentation began, finally found his voice. "Colonel, we had no idea that Sarah had been involved in anything so significant. She never mentioned any of this." "Sir," Colonel Martinez replied with the patient tone of someone explaining military culture to civilians, "service members who see combat often don't discuss their experiences with family members. The operations Sergeant Johnson participated in were classified for national security reasons. She was legally prohibited from sharing details about her work, even with loved ones." I could see the wheels turning in David's head as he processed this information. Like most of my relatives, he'd interpreted my reluctance to talk about my deployments as evidence that nothing important had happened, that my military service had been routine and unremarkable. The possibility that I'd been legally bound to keep quiet about significant operations had never occurred to him. Michelle stepped forward, her teacher's instincts apparently kicking in as she tried to process this new information about her extended family. Sarah, why didn't you tell us? We would have been so proud. The question hung in the air, and I felt Colonel Martinez's eyes on me, waiting to see how I would respond. The truth was complicated. I'd kept quiet partly because of classification requirements, but mostly because my family had never shown genuine interest in understanding my military experiences. They'd wanted to support me in abstract terms without engaging with the realities of what military service actually entailed. The operations were classified, I said simply, not wanting to get into the deeper issues of family dynamics in front of a military officer. I couldn't discuss details, and I didn't want to worry anyone. Patricia had remained silent during this exchange, but I could see her struggling with the cognitive dissonance of having to reconcile her public assessment of my worth with the official recognition I'd just received. She'd built her authority in the family partly on her ability to judge people accurately, to identify who deserved respect and who didn't. The Silver Star presentation had undermined that authority in the most public way possible. Uncle Rick, Patricia's husband, spoke up for the first time since the ceremony began. His voice carried the awkward tone of someone trying to smooth over a situation that had become uncomfortably dramatic. Well, this is certainly a surprise, Sarah. Congratulations, we're all very proud. The word proud felt hollow, given the context of what had happened earlier, but I nodded acknowledgement anyway. Military training teaches you to accept congratulations gracefully, even when they come from people whose sincerity is questionable. Colonel Martinez seemed to sense the underlying tension in the family dynamic, and he addressed it with the diplomatic skill that military officers develop when dealing with complex civilian situations. I should mention that the Pentagon specifically requested that this presentation be made in front of Sergeant Johnson's family. Military leadership believes that families should understand the significance of their loved one's service. The implication was clear. The military establishment had considered it important for my family to witness this recognition, to understand that my service had been meaningful and valuable. Given their recent behavior, the timing of this message felt particularly pointed. My cousin Reagan, who had been standing near the back of the gathering, finally spoke up. Sarah, I felt terrible earlier. If we'd known... You couldn't have known, I replied, cutting off what was clearly going to be an uncomfortable apology. The important thing is that the mission was successful and that lives were saved.
But Colonel Martinez wasn't finished. He opened his folder again and pulled out another document, this one looking even more official than the Silver Star citation. There's one more piece of information that I think the family should be aware of. Along with the Silver Star, Sergeant Johnson has been selected for induction into the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, which recognizes recipients of the highest military decorations. The Hall of Heroes. Even I knew what that meant. It was reserved for recipients of the Medal of Honor, Distinguished Service Cross, and Silver Star, the most elite level of military recognition. The fact that my photograph would hang in the Pentagon alongside the most decorated heroes in American military history felt surreal. Patricia finally found her voice, though it came out as more of a croak than her usual commanding tone. The Pentagon? Yes, ma'am. Sergeant Johnson will be formally inducted in a ceremony in Washington, D.C. next month. The Secretary of Defense will personally present her Hall of Heroes certificate, and the ceremony will be attended by senior military leadership from all branches of service. The silence that followed was different from the earlier shocked quiet. This was the silence of people trying to process information that completely contradicted their understanding of someone they'd known for decades. I could see relatives looking at me with expressions that ranged from amazement to something that might have been shame. Great Aunt Dorothy stood up again, her voice carrying the clear authority of the family's senior member. Colonel, thank you for coming here today to honor our Sarah. Frank always said that real courage was doing what needed to be done even when nobody was watching. It sounds like that's exactly what she did. The comparison to Uncle Frank again sent a ripple through the gathering. Frank had been the family's military hero, the standard against which all other achievements were measured. Having Dorothy explicitly compare my service to his carried weight that everyone understood. But it was Marcus who asked the question that I could see forming in several minds. Sarah, what was it like? I mean, what did you do over there? What was it actually like? The question was sincere, coming from genuine curiosity rather than the polite obligation that had characterized most family inquiries about my military service. But it was also a question that I'd never really been asked before, at least not by family members who were genuinely interested in the answer. I looked around the pavilion at faces that had become more attentive and respectful than I'd ever seen them. These were people who'd known me since childhood, who'd watched me make the decision to enlist, who'd sent care packages and welcomed me home from deployments. But they'd never really understood what I'd been doing during those years overseas. It was complicated, I said finally. We were trying to gather information that would help protect American soldiers and Afghan civilians. It meant spending weeks building relationships with people who were risking their lives to help us, working in areas where we knew hostile forces were watching us, and making decisions that could mean the difference between someone going home to their family or not. The simple honesty of the statement seemed to land differently than my previous attempts to explain my military experience. Maybe it was the context of the Silver Star presentation. Or maybe it was the fact that a full colonel had just validated the importance of my service. But for the first time, my family seemed to be actually listening to what I was saying about my time in Afghanistan. Colonel Martinez nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of work that wins wars, Sergeant. Not the dramatic battles that make headlines, but the patient, dangerous work of gathering intelligence and building relationships that actually save lives. The afternoon sun was getting lower, casting longer shadows across the pavilion, but nobody seemed eager to leave. For the first time in my adult life, I was the center of respectful attention at a family gathering, and people seemed genuinely interested in understanding what my military service had actually entailed. But I could see that Patricia was still struggling with the implications of what had just happened, and I suspected that her reaction to this dramatic reversal was far from over. The transformation in my family's attention was both gratifying and unsettling. For years, I'd been the peripheral figure at gatherings like this, the one whose military service was acknowledged with polite thank yous, but never really discussed or understood. Now I found myself surrounded by relatives who were suddenly eager to engage with details they'd never bothered to ask about before. But it wasn't just curiosity driving their newfound interest. I could see the calculations happening behind their eyes, the social mathematics that families perform when someone's status unexpectedly shifts. The Silver Star and Hall of Heroes induction weren't just personal recognition, they were social capital that reflected on the entire family. The kind of achievement that would be mentioned in Christmas letters and social media posts for years to come. My cousin David was the first to fully embrace this new dynamic, stepping forward with the enthusiasm of someone who'd just realized he was related to a celebrity. Sarah, this is incredible. I mean, the Hall of Heroes. That's like the military equivalent of the Hall of Fame, right? We should celebrate this properly. Maybe we could organize a family dinner when you go to Washington for the ceremony? The offer was generous, but it came with the kind of eager energy that suggested David was already thinking about how to leverage my recognition for his own social benefit. I could practically see him mentally composing LinkedIn posts about his heroic cousin and planning ways to work my achievements into his insurance sales conversations. Michelle joined the impromptu planning session, her teacher's organizational instincts kicking in. We should document this properly. Maybe we could get some photos with Colonel Martinez. And we should definitely record you talking about your experiences. The younger kids in the family should hear about this. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same family members who'd just witnessed my public humiliation were now eager to preserve every detail of my military recognition. But I tried to respond graciously, understanding that their excitement, however self-serving, was still better than the dismissive tolerance I'd grown accustomed to. Colonel Martinez observed this family dynamic with the perceptive awareness of someone who'd witnessed similar scenes at award ceremonies across the country. Military recognition often revealed family dynamics that had been hidden beneath polite surfaces, and he seemed to understand that my situation was more complex than a simple celebration. If I may, Colonel Martinez interjected diplomatically, I should mention that the Hall of Heroes ceremony will be a formal military event. Sergeant Johnson will be entitled to invite family members, but there are protocol requirements and security considerations that will need to be addressed. Patricia, who had been standing silent near the stage since the presentation, finally seemed to shake off her shock and reassert herself into the conversation. But her voice carried none of its earlier authority. Instead, she sounded tentative, almost pleading. Of course, we'll want to be there to support Sarah, she said, her words carefully chosen but lacking the commanding tone she'd used throughout the afternoon. This is such an honor for our entire family. The phrase our entire family hung in the air with particular weight, given that less than an hour ago, Patricia had publicly declared that I wasn't worthy of the family's respect. But military ceremonies have a way of forcing people to confront their own inconsistencies, and I could see her struggling to reconcile her earlier behavior with her current desire to be associated with my recognition. Great Aunt Dorothy, who had remained seated during the impromptu planning session, spoke up with the dry humor that had made her the family's unofficial truth teller for 8 decades. Patricia, dear, I think Sarah might want to invite people who've actually supported her military service, not just the ones who want to be in the photographs. The comment landed like a small bomb, creating a moment of uncomfortable silence as everyone processed Dorothy's pointed observation. She'd been watching family dynamics long enough to see through the sudden enthusiasm that had emerged in the wake of my recognition. But Dorothy wasn't finished. She stood up from her lawn chair with deliberate effort and walked over to where I was standing, her movements careful but determined. When she reached me, she took my hands in hers, her grip surprisingly strong despite her age. Sarah, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the pavilion. Frank would have been so proud of you. Not because of the medals, though they're wonderful, but because you did what needed to be done when it mattered. That's what real service looks like. The comparison to Uncle Frank again sent ripples through the gathering, but this time Dorothy's words carried an additional weight. She was explicitly contrasting real service with the performative patriotism that characterized most of the family's relationship with military issues. Colonel Martinez nodded approvingly at Dorothy's words. Ma'am, your husband's Bronze Star from Normandy represents the same kind of courage that Sergeant Johnson demonstrated in Afghanistan. Different wars, different enemies, but the same willingness to put mission and fellow soldiers above personal safety. The connection between my service and Uncle Frank's wartime heroism was something I'd never expected to hear articulated, especially not by someone of Colonel Martinez's stature. Frank had been the family's military legend, the standard against which all other achievements were measured. Having my service explicitly compared to his felt like validation at the deepest possible level. But it was Marcus who asked the question that cut to the heart of the family's sudden change in attitude. Sarah, how do you feel about all this? I mean, the way everyone's reacting now compared to. He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with finishing the sentence. The question forced everyone to confront the elephant that had been lurking at the edges of our conversation. My public humiliation at Patricia's hands was still fresh in everyone's memory, and my nephew's question highlighted the uncomfortable transition from family embarrassment to family hero that had occurred in the span of 30 minutes. I looked around at the faces surrounding me, some genuinely proud, others clearly uncomfortable with their earlier behavior, most trying to navigate the social complexity of a situation that had shifted dramatically and unexpectedly. These were people I'd known my entire life, who'd shaped my understanding of family loyalty and belonging, who'd also just demonstrated how conditional that belonging had always been. I feel grateful, I said finally, choosing my words carefully. Grateful that my service mattered, that lives were saved, and that the military has chosen to recognize the work my team did. As for everything else, I paused, meeting Patricia's eyes directly. I think today has been educational for everyone. The word educational was diplomatic enough to avoid direct confrontation while pointed enough to acknowledge the broader implications of what had transpired. Military training teaches you to address problems directly but professionally, and I was drawing on those skills to navigate a family situation that had become more complex than anyone had anticipated. Colonel Martinez seemed to sense that the family dynamic needed some space to process these revelations without the pressure of his official presence. Sergeant Johnson, he said, returning to formal protocol, I want to congratulate you again on this well-deserved recognition. You should be very proud of your service and the lives you've saved. He turned to address the broader family gathering. I want to thank all of you for allowing me to present this recognition in front of Sergeant Johnson's loved ones. Military service is always a family sacrifice, and it's important that families understand the significance of what their service members accomplish. The phrase family sacrifice carried particular weight in our current situation, highlighting the gap between the abstract support my family had provided and the genuine understanding that military service required. I could see several relatives shifting uncomfortably as they processed the implications of Colonel Martinez's words. Patricia made one final attempt to reassert some control over the situation, stepping forward with a smile that looked more strained than genuine. Colonel, thank you so much for coming today and for honoring our Sarah. This has been such a meaningful addition to our family reunion. But Colonel Martinez's response carried a subtle correction that didn't go unnoticed by anyone paying attention. Ma'am, I didn't come to add meaning to your reunion. I came to ensure that Sergeant Johnson received the recognition she earned through extraordinary service to her country. The distinction was small but significant. He was making it clear that my recognition stood on its own merit, independent of whatever family dynamics had been playing out at the reunion. It was a professional way of saying that my worth wasn't determined by my family's assessment, but by objective standards of military excellence. As Colonel Martinez prepared to leave, I realized that the afternoon had fundamentally changed, not just how my family saw me, but how I saw myself in relation to them. The Silver Star and Hall of Heroes recognition were meaningful, but they were also revealing truths about family loyalty, conditional respect, and the difference between being tolerated and being valued. The sun was setting over Riverside Park, casting long shadows across the pavilion where my family was still processing the most dramatic plot twist in Johnson family reunion history. After Colonel Martinez departed, the family stood around in small clusters, the energy of the ceremony giving way to something more uncomfortable. The dramatic revelation of my Silver Star had created a social situation that nobody quite knew how to navigate. People who'd spent years treating me as a peripheral family member were suddenly faced with the reality that I was arguably the most accomplished person at the reunion. Patricia made several attempts to restart normal conversation, but everything felt forced and artificial. She kept glancing at me with an expression that suggested she was trying to figure out how to walk back her earlier public humiliation without explicitly acknowledging what she'd done. The woman who'd confidently declared that nobody respected me was now facing the awkward reality that I'd just been honored with one of the military's highest decorations. My cousin Reagan approached me hesitantly, her usual confident demeanor replaced by something that looked almost like shame. Sarah, I need to apologize. What Patricia said earlier about respect and taking up space, that was completely out of line. We had no idea about your service record, but that's no excuse. The apology was sincere, but it highlighted the conditional nature of my family's regard. Their respect had been tied to their perception of my achievements, not to any inherent value I might have as a person or family member. Now that the achievements had been revealed, they were scrambling to adjust their treatment of me accordingly. I appreciate that, Reagan, I replied, trying to keep my voice neutral. But I think it's important to remember that my worth as a person wasn't determined by whether you knew about my military decorations. The work I did in Afghanistan was classified. I literally couldn't talk about it. But that doesn't mean the person you knew before today was somehow less valuable. David joined our conversation, his insurance salesman's instincts apparently telling him that this was a moment that required damage control. You're absolutely right, Sarah. We should have been more supportive all along. Maybe we can make up for lost time. I'd love to hear more about your experiences, and I think the whole family would benefit from understanding what you went through. The offer was well-intentioned, but it came with the slightly desperate energy of someone trying to repair a relationship that had been damaged by his own neglect. I could see similar conversations happening throughout the pavilion as relatives who'd dismissed my military service for years suddenly wanted to demonstrate their appreciation and interest. Marcus, who'd been one of the few family members to consistently treat me with genuine respect, seemed to understand the complexity of the situation better than most. You know what, Sarah? The medal is incredible and we're all proud of you. But I'm kind of ashamed that it took official recognition for everyone to start paying attention to what you've been dealing with since you got back. His honesty was refreshing, cutting through the awkward attempts at retroactive support that were happening around us. Marcus had always been perceptive about family dynamics, and he was willing to acknowledge that the problem wasn't just ignorance about my military achievements. It was a more fundamental failure to value me as a person. Patricia had been hovering at the edges of these conversations, clearly wanting to insert herself, but seemingly unsure how to approach me after her earlier behavior. Finally, she walked over with the kind of determined expression that suggested she'd rehearsed what she was going to say. Sarah, she began, her voice carrying a forced brightness, I want you to know what I said earlier. I was just frustrated about some family issues that have nothing to do with you. I didn't mean to suggest that you weren't valued or respected. We're all so proud of your service. The apology was carefully worded to minimize her responsibility, while acknowledging that something inappropriate had occurred, but it avoided the central issue. She'd publicly humiliated me in front of the entire family, declaring that nobody respected me and that I was taking up space. No amount of retroactive pride could undo the damage of that moment. Patricia, I said, my voice carrying the calm authority I'd learned to use in difficult military situations. I think we both know that what happened earlier wasn't about frustration or family issues. It was about how you really see me and how you've always seen me. The Silver Star doesn't change who I was yesterday or last week or last year. The directness of my response seemed to catch her off guard. She'd probably expected me to accept her apology gracefully and move on, allowing everyone to pretend that the earlier incident had been a simple misunderstanding. Instead, I was forcing her to confront the reality of what she'd revealed about her true feelings. Uncle Rick, who'd been watching this exchange with obvious discomfort, tried to smooth things over with the diplomatic skills he'd developed during decades of marriage to Patricia. I think everyone's emotions are running high today. Maybe we should just focus on celebrating Sarah's achievements and move forward as a family. But Great Aunt Dorothy, who'd been observing the family dynamics with the sharp awareness of someone who'd seen 8 decades of human behavior, wasn't willing to let the moment pass without comment. Rick, dear, some things can't be smoothed over with nice words. Patricia said exactly what she meant, and now she's learning that actions have consequences. Dorothy's blunt assessment created another moment of uncomfortable silence. She'd cut through the polite attempts at reconciliation to highlight the fundamental issue. Patricia's behavior had revealed something about her character that couldn't be easily dismissed or forgotten. The afternoon was winding down, and I could see that some family members were beginning to pack up their belongings and prepare to leave. But there was still an unresolved tension in the air, a sense that the day's events had exposed fault lines in the family that would take time to address. I found myself thinking about my future relationship with these people, wondering whether the Silver Star presentation had fundamentally changed our dynamic or simply revealed truths that had always been there. Military service teaches you to assess situations clearly and make decisions based on evidence rather than wishful thinking. And the evidence suggested that my family's newfound respect was more about social appearances than genuine appreciation. As I watched Patricia struggle to navigate the aftermath of her earlier behavior, I realized that the most important lesson of the day wasn't about military recognition or family dynamics. It was about the difference between conditional respect and unconditional value, and the importance of understanding that distinction in all relationships. The weeks following the reunion passed in a blur of phone calls, emails, and unexpected attention. Word of my Silver Star had spread beyond the family, and I found myself fielding congratulations from people I hadn't heard from in years. Former classmates reached out through social media, neighbors stopped me at the grocery store, and my story even made it into the local veterans newsletter. But the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. 3 days after the reunion, I received a handwritten letter from Great Aunt Dorothy, her careful script filling 2 pages of cream-colored stationery that smelled faintly of lavender. Dear Sarah, she'd written, I wanted you to know that Frank came home from the war a different man than the boy who'd left. Not broken, but changed in ways that took years for me to understand. He used to say that the hardest part wasn't what happened overseas. It was coming home to people who thought they knew what his service meant but had never bothered to ask. I see that same struggle in you, and I want you to know that some of us have been paying attention all along. The letter went on to share details about Frank's adjustment to civilian life that I'd never heard before: the nightmares, the difficulty finding work, the way some family members had treated his war stories as entertainment rather than trauma. Reading Dorothy's words, I realized that my experience wasn't unique, that the gap between military service and civilian understanding had been affecting veterans and their families for generations. More importantly, Dorothy's letter included a practical offer. Frank left behind all his military papers and photographs in a trunk in my attic. I think it's time they found their way to someone who would understand their value. Would you like to come for lunch next Sunday and take a look? That Sunday lunch became the beginning of something I hadn't expected: a real relationship with the one family member who truly understood what military service meant. Dorothy's small house was filled with photographs and mementos from Frank's wartime service, but more than that, it was filled with stories about the man behind the medals. He never talked much about the fighting, Dorothy told me as we sat in her living room, Frank's Purple Heart and Bronze Star displayed in a shadow box on the mantel. But he talked about the men he served with, about the responsibility he felt for keeping them safe. I think that's what stayed with him the most. Not the fear for his own life, but the weight of other people's lives in his hands. I understood that weight intimately. The Silver Star citation mentioned the American lives saved by my intelligence work, but it didn't capture the sleepless nights I'd spent worrying about my team's safety or the guilt I still carried about the soldiers who'd been killed before we managed to disrupt the IED network. Through Dorothy, I began to understand that my struggle to fit back into civilian life wasn't a personal failing. It was part of a larger pattern that affected many veterans. The family's difficulty understanding my service wasn't malicious. It was simply ignorance, the same ignorance that had affected military families for decades. But understanding the pattern didn't make it less painful. The Hall of Heroes ceremony in Washington was scheduled for the following month, and I found myself dreading the family dynamics that would inevitably surround the event. Patricia had been calling regularly, offering to help coordinate travel arrangements and suggesting family photo opportunities that made me uncomfortable. The breakthrough came during one of these calls when Patricia's forced enthusiasm finally cracked, and she said something that sounded genuine. "Sarah, I need to be honest with you. I don't know how to fix what I said at the reunion. I was wrong and I'm embarrassed, and I don't know how to make it right." The admission was more valuable than all her previous attempts at damage control. For the first time since the reunion, she was acknowledging the reality of what had happened, rather than trying to minimize or explain it away. "Patricia," I said, "I appreciate your honesty, but I think you need to understand that this isn't just about one bad moment. It's about years of being treated like I didn't quite belong, like my choices weren't valid, like my service was something to be tolerated rather than respected." The conversation that followed was difficult but necessary. Patricia admitted that she'd never understood why I'd chosen military service over college, that she'd seen my enlistment as evidence of limited options rather than a deliberate choice. She'd treated my deployments as unfortunate interruptions to my real life, rather than as meaningful work that served a larger purpose. More importantly, she acknowledged that her behavior at the reunion had revealed something ugly about her own character: the tendency to judge people's worth based on her own narrow definition of success. The Silver Star presentation had forced her to confront the possibility that she'd been wrong about me for years. "I want to do better," she said finally. "Not because of the medal, but because you deserve better from your family. All of us do." The Hall of Heroes ceremony in Washington became something different than I'd initially imagined. Instead of an obligation to include family members who'd suddenly become interested in my achievements, it became an opportunity to share something meaningful with the people who'd genuinely supported me throughout my military service. I invited Dorothy, of course, along with Marcus and a few cousins who'd consistently treated me with respect. But I also invited people who weren't technically family: my former team members who could attend, a few veteran friends who understood the significance of the recognition, and my old high school counselor who'd supported my decision to enlist when others had questioned it. The ceremony itself was everything I'd hoped it would be. Standing in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, surrounded by photographs of America's most decorated military personnel, I finally felt like my service had been properly recognized and honored. The Secretary of Defense's words about courage and sacrifice carried weight that civilian praise never could, and seeing my photograph added to the wall of heroes felt like the culmination of a journey that had begun 12 years earlier in a strip mall recruiting office. But the most meaningful moment came afterward, during the reception, when Dorothy pulled me aside and showed me something she'd brought: a small metal case containing Frank's Bronze Star and Purple Heart. "I want you to have these," she said simply. Frank would have wanted them to go to someone who understood what they really meant. Standing in the Pentagon, holding the medals that had belonged to my great uncle, I finally understood that military service created bonds that went beyond blood relations. The real family wasn't necessarily the one you were born into. It was the one that recognized your worth, supported your choices, and honored your service whether or not anyone else was watching. 6 months after the Hall of Heroes ceremony, I was sitting in my new office in downtown Atlanta, reviewing applications for what had become the most meaningful work of my civilian life. The bronze nameplate on my desk read Sarah Johnson, Executive Director, Clear Path Veterans Foundation, and the walls were lined with photographs from various military ceremonies and veteran support events. The foundation had grown out of conversations that began during my Pentagon visit. Meeting other Silver Star recipients had opened my eyes to a common thread running through many of our stories: the struggle to translate military service into civilian success. Not because we lacked skills or dedication, but because the systems weren't designed to recognize or utilize what we had to offer. My first hire had been Marcus, who'd left his corporate job to become our program coordinator. His enthusiasm for helping veterans navigate the transition to civilian life had surprised everyone in the family, but it hadn't surprised me. The reunion had affected him deeply, opening his eyes to realities about military service that he'd never considered. "Sarah," he said, knocking on my office door, "the Johnson family wants to schedule a visit to tour the facility." Patricia called again this morning. I looked up from the grant application I'd been reviewing. The foundation occupied 3 floors of a renovated building, providing career counseling, mental health support, and transitional housing for veterans struggling with the adjustment to civilian life. We'd helped 43 veterans find meaningful employment in our first 6 months, and our success rate was attracting attention from other cities interested in replicating our model. "Tell her they're welcome to visit during regular tour hours," I replied. "Same as any other community members." The relationship with my extended family had evolved into something more honest but more distant. Patricia had made genuine efforts to repair our relationship, including a substantial donation to the foundation, but we both understood that some damage couldn't be completely undone. The reunion had revealed truths about conditional respect and family loyalty that couldn't be forgotten, even if they could be forgiven. But not all the family relationships had remained strained. Dorothy had become one of my closest confidants, visiting the foundation regularly and sharing Frank's military papers with veterans who were interested in World War II history. Her perspective on military service, shaped by decades of living with a combat veteran, had proven invaluable in designing our support programs. The foundation's success had brought unexpected opportunities. I'd been invited to speak at conferences about veteran employment, had testified before a congressional subcommittee about gaps in veteran services, and had been featured in several articles about innovative approaches to supporting military families. But the most satisfying aspect of the work was direct. Sitting across from veterans who were struggling with the same challenges I'd faced, helping them understand that their military experience was valuable, that their skills translated to civilian success, and that their worth wasn't determined by other people's ability to recognize their contributions. That afternoon, I had a meeting with Jennifer Martinez, a former Army medic who'd served 2 tours in Iraq. She'd been struggling to find work that matched her skills and experience, despite having managed field hospitals under combat conditions. "I keep getting interviews," she told me, her frustration evident. "But they always ask about my leadership experience. Like running a medical unit in a war zone doesn't count as a real management." Her story was depressingly familiar. Employers who claimed to value veterans often had little understanding of what military service actually entailed, treating it as a checkbox for diversity rather than a source of genuine qualifications. Jennifer, I said, pulling out a folder that contained job descriptions from companies that had partnered with our foundation. Let me show you some positions with employers who actually understand military experience. The conversation that followed was one of dozens I'd had with veterans who possessed extraordinary skills but struggled to translate them into civilian terminology. Military service created leaders, problem solvers, and crisis managers, but those qualities were often invisible to employers who'd never worked with veterans. As Jennifer left with several job leads and a renewed sense of confidence, I reflected on how much my own understanding of success had changed since the reunion. The Silver Star and Hall of Heroes recognition had been meaningful, but they were ultimately external validation. The real satisfaction came from using my experience to help other veterans navigate challenges that I understood intimately. My phone buzzed with a text from Dorothy. Saw the article about the foundation in the Journal Constitution. Frank would be so proud. Can you come for dinner Sunday? I'm making his mother's pot roast recipe. These weekly dinners had become a cherished routine, a connection to family history that felt more authentic than most of the relationships I'd maintained with my blood relatives. Dorothy understood that military service changed people in ways that couldn't be easily explained or quickly forgotten, and she'd created space for that understanding in ways that others hadn't. That evening, I drove home to my apartment in Virginia Highland, a neighborhood that felt more like home than anywhere I'd lived since enlisting. The walls were decorated with photographs from my military service, including one of my team in Afghanistan that had been taken just weeks before the IED incident that ended my career. But the photograph that meant the most to me was a recent addition, a picture from the Foundation's grand opening, showing me cutting a ribbon while surrounded by veterans we'd helped find employment. In the background, you could see Dorothy beaming with pride, Marcus coordinating media interviews, and even Patricia, looking genuinely supportive rather than performatively enthusiastic. The reunion had been a turning point, but not in the way anyone had expected. It hadn't magically transformed my family relationships or resolved years of misunderstanding. Instead, it had clarified what really mattered, not the conditional respect that came with medals and recognition, but the meaningful work of helping others who faced similar challenges. Military service has taught me that the most important battles aren't always the most visible ones, and that real victory often looks like quiet persistence rather than dramatic triumph. The foundation represented both lessons, a quiet but persistent effort to change how society valued military experience, one veteran at a time. As I looked out my apartment window at the Atlanta skyline, I realized that I'd finally found my place in the civilian world. Not as someone trying to prove my worth to people who'd never bothered to understand it, but as someone using my experience to create value for others who deserved better than conditional respect. The reunion had ended with my family finally seeing me clearly, but the more important outcome was that I'd finally learned to see myself clearly too, not as someone seeking validation, but as someone with something valuable to offer. A year later, I received an unexpected package in the mail. No return address, just my name written in careful script that looked familiar. Inside was a framed photograph from the reunion, the moment right after Colonel Martinez presented my Silver Star. But it wasn't the medal ceremony that caught my attention. It was Patricia's face in the background. The photographer had captured the exact moment when everything clicked for her, when she realized what she'd done and who she'd been dismissing all those years. Her expression showed genuine shock, shame, and something that looked like the beginning of understanding. At the bottom of the frame, someone had written in gold lettering, "Sometimes the loudest thing you can say is nothing at all." I smiled, recognizing Dorothy's handwriting. Even at 87, she was still teaching family lessons in the most elegant way possible. That afternoon, I got a call from a producer at CNN. They wanted to feature the foundation in a documentary about veteran success stories. As I hung up the phone, I thought about that girl who'd walked out of the reunion pavilion, holding her paper plate and her dignity while her family laughed. She couldn't have imagined that her quiet response to public humiliation would lead to this: a foundation helping hundreds of veterans, national recognition for innovative military support programs, and most importantly, the knowledge that her service had created ripples that would continue long after the medals were forgotten. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's building something so meaningful that the people who doubted you have no choice but to reconsider everything they thought they knew about worth, respect, and what it really means to serve. What's your story? Have you ever been underestimated by the people closest to you? Drop a comment below. I read every single one. And if this story resonated with you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. These stories of quiet strength and unexpected triumph are exactly what this channel is all about. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.